They fed families through hardship, yet you will not find these poor man meals in modern kitchens or on store shelves. Why were these humble recipes buried in old cookbooks, and what did we lose when we stopped passing them down? Milk toast was not fancy, but in times when families had nothing left but stale bread and a splash of milk, it became a warm, life-saving comfort. Made by gently toasting slices of day-old bread and soaking them in hot milk sweetened with sugar or lightly salted with butter, milk toast was the definition of simple survival food. Some added a dash of cinnamon. Others thickened the milk with a bit of flour to stretch it further. It was soft, filling, and easy on empty stomachs, ideal for children, the sick, or anyone who needed warmth more than flavor. In the Great Depression, milk toast showed up in countless kitchen notebooks, scribbled beside other dishes made from almost nothing. It might not win awards today, but in hard times, milk toast was enough to remind a struggling family that they could still share a meal and still share hope. Creamed chipped beef on toast was salty, rich, and unforgettable, not because it was fancy, but because it was served when nothing else was available. Soldiers knew it by another name, a name not polite enough to print in most cookbooks: stuff on a shingle. It was made from dried beef, often canned or jarred, sliced into strips and simmered in a thick white gravy made of flour, butter, and milk. That gravy was poured over slices of toast, sometimes stale, sometimes scorched, but always appreciated. The salty meat and creamy sauce combined into something that stuck to your ribs and warmed you up fast. After World War II, veterans brought the recipe home. It started showing up in diners, school cafeterias, and humble kitchens across the country. It was cheap, it was fast, and it turned scraps into something that could feed a whole table. Creamed chipped beef on toast was not just a dish. It was a reminder that sometimes survival looks like a plate scraped clean. Mock apple pie was a trick of the tongue, a sleight of hand in the world of wartime baking. When real apples were too expensive or out of season, home bakers turned to something else entirely: crackers. Saltines, crushed and soaked in a syrup made from sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar, formed the filling. With the right spices, mostly cinnamon and nutmeg, it smelled like pie. It even tasted like pie. And unless you were told, you might never guess that the apples inside were just softened, sweetened crackers. This recipe became a quiet star in old cookbooks during the Great Depression and World War II. When rationing made creativity essential, it was about resourcefulness, not deception. Families needed dessert, just intention, and a little bit of cinnamon. For those who grew up on it, the first bite still brings back the magic of making do and making joy from nothing. Potato candy sounds like a contradiction, but for generations, it was one of the cheapest, sweetest treats you could make at home. It began with a single leftover mashed potato, just one. To that, home cooks added powdered sugar, a little at a time, until it turned into a stiff dough. That dough was rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, and then tightly rolled again like a jelly roll. Sliced into pinwheels, the result was rich, creamy, and almost fudge-like. No one could believe it started with a potato. It required no baking, no eggs, and no fancy ingredients, just sugar, peanut butter, and leftovers. In hard times, potato candy appeared at holiday tables, on Sunday dessert plates, and inside tin lunchboxes. It was especially popular in Appalachian kitchens, where thrift and creativity walked hand in hand. It looked like something you would find in a candy shop, but it came from the humblest of ingredients. Kids loved the sweetness, adults loved the nostalgia, and everyone loved that it cost next to nothing. Potato candy was not just dessert, it was proof that when sugar was scarce and spirits low, you could still roll up something sweet. Cornmeal mush was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, depending on how tight things were. Made from water, salt, and cornmeal stirred into a thick porridge, it was one of the oldest and most adaptable poor man meals. While hot, it was ladled into bowls and eaten with a little milk, molasses, or bacon drippings if you were lucky. Once cooled, it firmed into a solid loaf that could be sliced and fried in a skillet until golden brown. Fried cornmeal mush developed a crispy edge and a creamy center, making it a favorite among those who knew how to stretch a pantry. It was incredibly cheap to make. A single sack of cornmeal could feed a family for weeks. You would find it in southern homes, Midwest farms, and mountain cabins. Anywhere a hot, filling meal was needed without spending more than a few cents. Some paired it with beans, others topped it with syrup. It might not be on today's breakfast menus, but in those handwritten cookbooks, it remains a quiet legend, proof that even the simplest grains could carry a family through. Tomato gravy and biscuits sounds unusual today, but in the rural South, it was once a go-to breakfast for those with more tomatoes than money. Canned or fresh tomatoes were simmered with flour, fat, and milk to create a creamy, tangy sauce that was poured generously over hot biscuits. If you had bacon grease, you used it. If not, butter or lard worked fine. The gravy was thick, pinkish, and full of flavor, a bright, hearty start to the day when sausage or eggs were out of reach. Some people added sugar. Others kept it sharp and savory. It was born from necessity but stayed because it was delicious. Old cookbooks passed the recipe down with pride, often scribbled in pencil with side notes like, "Add more pepper if Papa's home." For many families, tomato gravy and biscuits were not just a meal. They were the taste of early mornings on a porch swing, of hot kitchens and clattering pans. It filled you up and left just enough for leftovers at lunch. And while it has nearly disappeared from modern menus, those who remember it know, few things stick to your ribs, or your memory, like tomato gravy made from scratch. Egg drop soup in farmhouse kitchens was nothing like the kind served in takeout boxes today. It started with homemade broth, often from chicken bones or vegetable scraps, and was gently simmered until fragrant. Then came the eggs. Fresh from the backyard coop, they were beaten and slowly poured into the hot broth, stirring as you poured to create thin ribbons of cooked egg. Some added a handful of chopped herbs. Others threw in leftover vegetables or a scoop of rice. But even in its plainest form, this soup was soothing, warming, and incredibly cheap. It required only 2 ingredients and could be made in under 10 minutes. It was often scribbled in the back pages of old recipe books. No measurements needed, just a note that read, "Broth, egg, stir slow." And in those 3 steps lived a kind of comfort that has quietly survived generations. Even now, it still tastes like home, like healing, like doing a lot with very little. Peanut butter stuffed celery was a party plate staple and a lunchbox treat in lean times. It was cheap, cheerful, and deceptively filling. Stalks of celery were washed, trimmed, and filled with a thick layer of peanut butter, sometimes smooth, sometimes crunchy, depending on what was on hand. If there was a little more room in the grocery budget, raisins were pressed on top, turning them into what children called ants on a log. But even without the extras, it worked. The crunch of the celery, the richness of the peanut butter, the contrast of cold and creamy, it hit all the right notes for a simple snack. It required no cooking, no prep, and no waste. Celery was cheap. Peanut butter could last weeks. For those who grew up on it, peanut butter stuffed celery was more than a snack. It was proof that a little could go a long way. Wilted lettuce salad sounds like a mistake, but in Depression-era kitchens, it was a delicacy born from ingenuity. When fresh garden greens began to turn or lose their crispness, nothing went to waste. Instead of tossing the leaves, cooks revived them with hot bacon grease poured directly over the bowl. That sizzle? That was the magic. The dressing was simple: bacon drippings, a splash of vinegar, maybe a pinch of sugar and black pepper. The hot fat softened the greens instantly, wilting them into something tender and savory with just enough bite. Sometimes there were bits of crumbled bacon or sliced onions tossed in too. For many, the smell of vinegar hitting hot grease still brings back memories of crowded tables, patched-together meals, and the comfort of eating what was on hand. Wilted lettuce salad was not a compromise, it was a celebration of survival. Slumgulion stew was never written the same way twice, and that was the point. It was not really a recipe so much as a habit, a way to gather scraps and make something warm, filling, and slightly different every time. Ground meat if you had it. Pasta or potatoes if those were on hand. maybe a can of beans, maybe chopped onions, maybe some leftover gravy to pull it all together. Seasonings were whatever lived in the back of the cupboard. Slumgulion had no rules, only a purpose: fill the belly, stretch the food, waste nothing. Its name was funny, but its role was serious. Families made it at the end of the week, at the end of the month, when the budget wore thin and creativity took over. Every region had a version. Some called it hash, others called it goulash. But all of them knew the value of a big pot that could simmer all afternoon and feed everyone who came to the table. Slumgulion stew was not pretty, but it was honest, and if you ask the people who grew up eating it, they will tell you. It tasted like home, and there was always enough to go around. Johnny cakes were more than just cornmeal pancakes. They were survival food that moved west with families looking for land, work, and a fresh start. Made with just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, these flat griddle cakes were cooked over open flames in cast iron pans or even on hot stones if nothing else was available. When flour was scarce and yeast was a luxury, cornmeal stepped in. Some added a bit of lard or milk if they had it. Others sweetened them with molasses. But at their heart, Johnny cakes were portable, durable, and deeply American. You could stack them, wrap them, carry them for days. Pioneers ate them on wagon trails. Farmhands ate them at dawn. Johnny cakes were plain, yes, but they held the warmth of mornings, the scent of wood smoke, and the quiet strength of meals made to last. Bolognia casserole was the secret weapon of thrifty home cooks, the kind of dish that never made headlines but always made the best of what was left in the fridge. Old cookbooks tucked it between tuna noodle bake and hot dish, scribbled with loose instructions like, use what you have. Sliced bologna, diced potatoes, canned soup, shredded cheese. No two versions were the same, and that was the point. It was salty, creamy, warm, and just a little bit weird. Sometimes there were noodles, sometimes breadcrumbs. Always a bubbling mess of comfort. In households where meat was a treat and leftovers were precious, Bolognia casserole made sure nothing went to waste. Kids gobbled it up, dads took second helpings. And even if no one bragged about it, the dish did its job. It filled plates and stretched the budget. It was not meant to impress guests. It was meant to carry you to payday. And in its gooey, brown-top simplicity, it did exactly that. For many, Bolognia casserole still lives on in memory, tied to the scent of overworked ovens, chipped casserole dishes, and quiet evenings when everything somehow came together. Rice and raisin pudding was dessert born from a handful of pantry staples and a whole lot of love. It took just a scoop of cooked rice, a handful of raisins, some sugar, a bit of milk, and maybe an egg if you had one to spare. Everything went into the oven in one dish, slowly baking into a thick, custardy pudding that smelled like warmth and childhood. The raisins puffed up sweet and sticky. The rice turned creamy, and the top browned just enough to form a soft skin that you either loved or peeled off with a spoon. It was simple, yes, but it felt like luxury when there was nothing else sweet in the house. Old cookbooks kept it alive with short entries, no frills, no frosting, just rice, milk, sugar, bake until firm. Grandmothers stirred it slowly. Children waited at the table. It was dessert, breakfast, and sometimes both in the same day. Served warm with a pat of butter or cold from the icebox, rice and raisin pudding proved that comfort could come from almost nothing. It did not need fruit filling or pie crust. It just needed care and a little bit of sweetness. Ham hock and beans were a meal that simmered all day and fed a house all night. One smoked ham hock, bony, fatty, and tough, was all it took to flavor a pot of dried beans. You soaked the beans overnight, rinsed them clean, and let them cook low and slow with onions, garlic, or whatever seasoning was left on the shelf. The meat would fall off the bone, tender and salty, dissolving into the broth. Every bite was hearty, earthy, and deeply filling. This was not fast food. It was food made with patience and thrift, often set to cook at sunrise and ladled out at supper. You would find it in kitchens from the South to the Midwest, a staple in coal towns and farmhouses alike. Cornbread on the side turned it into a feast. Leftovers were better the next day. In old recipe books, it showed up with no exact measurements, just wisdom handed down and a note that said, "Let it simmer." For families counting every cent, ham, hock, and beans stretched farther than any roast or steak. And with each bowl, they carried the quiet pride of turning scraps into something deeply nourishing. Water pie was the kind of dessert that made people raise an eyebrow until they tasted it. Born out of the Dust Bowl and revived in the Great Depression, this pie used no eggs, no milk, and very little butter. Just water, sugar, flour, and a bit of vanilla or cinnamon if it was on hand. Everything was stirred together in a pie crust, yes, with water as the filling base, and baked until it set into a soft, jelly-like texture. The result was delicate, sweet, and gently spiced. It was a miracle of thrift, a dessert from near-empty shelves. Grandmothers made it when nothing else was left, when birthdays needed celebrating, or when Sunday dinner called for something sweet. Some recipes called it transparent pie. Others just called it hard times pie. But it showed up again and again in regional cookbooks, quietly offering hope. Served warm or chilled, with maybe a dollop of cream or just plain, water pie reminded people that dessert was not about decadence. It was about making something special from almost nothing. One bite, and you understood. Even in the leanest years, sweetness could still find a way to the table. Potato peel soup was proof that not a single scrap should be wasted. In families where every potato was peeled with care, the skins were never tossed out. Instead, they were saved, boiled, and turned into broth. Add a bit of onion, a pat of butter or lard, maybe a splash of milk or a spoonful of flour, and you had a soup that filled the belly and warmed the soul. The peels added earthy flavor, the broth turned cloudy with starch, and the result was surprisingly rich for something made from what others threw away. It was not glamorous, it was not photographed in cookbooks, but it showed up in the margins, in notes scribbled beside stew recipes or written on slips of paper tucked into flour tins. Some added carrots, some added herbs from the windowsill. But at its core, potato peel soup was survival cuisine. It tasted like resourcefulness. It taught children that food was never just food. It was memory, effort, and respect. Even now, in kitchens far removed from the Dust Bowl or Depression years, the idea lingers. If you have a peel and a pot, you have the start of supper. Spam hash was born from rations, but it became a regular dinner in homes where canned meat was the only meat you had. The process was simple. Open a can of Spam, dice it small, and fry it with chopped potatoes, onions, and sometimes peppers if you were lucky. It browned in the skillet, crisped at the edges, and sent out the kind of savory smell that made you forget how little it cost. Spam was cheap, shelf-stable, and flexible. It was fried, baked, mixed into casseroles, or folded into eggs. But hash was where it shined. Everything cooked in one pan. Everything stretched just a little further. In the 1940s and 1950s, old cookbooks praised Spam hash for being budget-friendly and filling. Soldiers had eaten it overseas. Families brought it home. It did not need to be elegant. It just needed to be hot and hearty. With a fried egg on top, it felt almost like a diner breakfast. Without it, it was still dinner. For many, Spam hash was not a novelty. It was the meal that kept food on the table when options ran thin. And in that salty, crispy bite lived a memory of making ends meet. Dandelion greens with vinegar came not from the grocery store, but from the front yard. In the spring, before gardens were ready and wallets were thin, families foraged for fresh greens wherever they could find them. Dandelions, bitter, wild, and free, were gathered by the handful, washed, and boiled to soften the bite. After draining, they were drizzled with hot bacon grease, a splash of vinegar, and a sprinkle of salt. Some added onions, others stirred in a bit of sugar to cut the tang. But no matter how it was seasoned, it was a side dish pulled straight from the land. It cost nothing, it fed many, and it brought a sense of pride to the table, because it meant someone had gone out and found the food themselves. These recipes were rarely written down. They were passed by memory, by gesture, by the feel of the leaves in your hands. In Appalachian hills, in rural Midwest towns, and on back porches across the South, Dandelion greens showed up every spring. Not as decoration, not as salad, but as supper. And they tasted like sunshine, hard work, and the wisdom to use what grows under your feet. Cabbage and noodles, or haluski as some called it, was the carb-heavy comfort food of coal country. Cheap, simple, and filling, it started with onions fried in butter or lard until golden and fragrant. Then came chopped cabbage, sautéed until tender and just slightly sweet. Finally, boiled egg noodles were folded in, turning the mixture into a warm, buttery bowl of goodness that cost almost nothing and fed everyone. It was eaten in steel towns, mining camps, and working-class neighborhoods across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and beyond. Sometimes bacon bits were added, sometimes it was plain, but always it was enough. The ingredients were humble. The flavor was not. In handwritten cookbooks, haluski showed up again and again, often listed simply as cabbage and noodles, make double. It was served on Mondays, on cold nights, or whenever the paycheck had not yet come through. It needed no side dishes, no garnishes, just a big spoon and an empty plate. For many, the smell of cabbage frying still brings back memories of steam-filled kitchens, worn aprons, and long tables crowded with family. Haluski was more than a meal. It was warmth, tradition, and the comfort of carbs when comfort was what you needed most. Oatmeal meatloaf was what you made when ground beef had to stretch and breadcrumbs were in short supply. It started like any other meatloaf: eggs, seasoning, a bit of ketchup, but instead of dry crumbs, it used oats to bind everything together. Old-fashioned oats were cheap and filling. They soaked up flavor, held their shape, and made the loaf firm enough to slice and serve. Some recipes added chopped onion or grated carrot. Others kept it bare bones. Either way, the oatmeal turned this dish into something that could last 2 or 3 meals. It baked up moist, hearty, and satisfying. In lean years, it was often the only way to make 1 pound of meat feed a whole family. Leftovers became sandwiches, crumbled into soup, or fried into patties. You could find it in Depression-era pamphlets, wartime cookbooks, and cards tucked behind refrigerator magnets. It was not glamorous. It did not photograph well, but it filled plates and bellies and empty pockets. For many who grew up with it, oatmeal meatloaf is still the taste of making something from almost nothing and doing it with pride, a baking dish, and just enough oats to hold everything together. Banana mayonnaise sandwiches were the strange little treat that confused outsiders but comforted those who grew up with them. It started with white sandwich bread, soft and cheap. One side was slathered with mayonnaise, the other layered with slices of ripe banana. Pressed together, it made a sandwich that was creamy, sweet, tangy, and oddly satisfying. In some homes, a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon was added. In others, it was left plain. There was no cooking involved, just slicing, spreading, and eating. These sandwiches were quick, cheap, and packed with calories, perfect for kids who needed something in their stomachs before heading out the door. During the Great Depression and well into the 1940s, banana mayonnaise sandwiches filled lunchboxes and breakfast plates. Boiled dinner was never glamorous, but it had heart. A pot of cabbage, potatoes, and maybe a carrot or two, all simmered slowly in a big pot of salted water. If meat was available, it was often a tough cut, something like salt pork, ham hock, or maybe a scrap of corned beef tossed in for flavor. But even without meat, the vegetables absorbed the salt and fat, growing soft and savory with every hour of simmering. Families called it a feast, even if they quietly wished for more meat. It was served steaming, ladled straight into bowls, usually without garnish. Sometimes the cabbage was cooked until translucent. Sometimes the potatoes broke apart with just a nudge. The broth, thin and peppery, was often the best part. Boiled dinner was common in New England, but variations appeared everywhere, wherever people needed to stretch $1 and feed many mouths. In cookbooks, it was tucked behind the roasts and casseroles, but it lingered longest in memory. It was a pot on the back of the stove, a smell that meant dinner would be hot and ready, even if it was humble. It was not about indulgence. It was about togetherness and making the most of what you had. Eggless, milkless, butterless cake sounded like a joke, but it came out of the oven rich, dark, and sweet. During wartime rationing and the Great Depression, ingredients like eggs and butter were too expensive or simply unavailable, but people still wanted cake. So they improvised. This dessert, often called wacky cake or depression cake, used oil instead of butter, vinegar and baking soda instead of eggs, and water to bring it all together. The batter mixed quickly in one bowl. No electric mixer required. Sometimes cocoa was added, sometimes raisins or cinnamon. It was poured into a simple pan, baked until the top cracked, and cooled right on the counter. The texture was moist, the flavor surprisingly deep. Children never noticed what was missing. This cake proved that even when shelves were bare, there was still room for dessert. And for those who baked it, sliced it, and served it proudly, there was comfort in knowing that a little bit of sugar and creativity could go a long way. Mock chicken legs were a clever disguise, a frugal attempt to serve something that looked like meat on the bone without actually being chicken. Ground meat, often pork or beef, was seasoned and formed around a stick or skewer to resemble a drumstick. It was then breaded, fried, or baked until golden and served with gravy or dipping sauce. To children, it looked like a special meal. To adults, it was just another way to stretch what little they had. Old cookbooks treated it as an inventive weeknight dinner, sometimes listing it as city chicken, even though there was no bird in sight. Some versions were dipped in egg and cracker crumbs. Others were made entirely from leftover meat scraps mashed together and shaped by hand. For those who grew up with it, the crisp coating and tender middle still taste like home, resourcefulness, and that rare kind of pride that comes from making something out of almost nothing. Rice and gravy was not fancy, but it was sacred in households where meat was rare and money was tight. A pot of white rice, boiled until soft, formed the base. On top, you poured a thin gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and water, whatever could be whisked together in the bottom of a skillet after cooking something else. Sometimes there was no meat at all, just the memory of it left in the grease. But that gravy was rich, savory, and enough to make plain rice feel like dinner. Kids licked their plates clean. Adults sighed at the taste, not because it was gourmet, but because it was good enough. It was comfort on hard days. It was filling when the fridge was nearly empty. And for many, it was the first dish they learned to cook because it was simple, dependable, and always welcome. In the end, rice and gravy was not just food. It was a quiet act of care, served warm and poured generously. Bread pudding was the sweet answer to stale loaves and empty cupboards. Instead of tossing hardened slices, home cooks soaked them in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and spices, then baked it until golden and fragrant. The result was soft in the middle, crispy on top, and rich with cinnamon and vanilla. Raisins often made their way in, and if cream was available, it was poured on top or whipped into a drizzle. But even without extras, it was satisfying, sweet enough to serve at Sunday supper, yet humble enough for an ordinary weekday dessert. Bread pudding appeared in cookbooks across generations, often with notes like, "Do not throw old bread away," or "Add nutmeg for warmth." Today, the scent of bread pudding in the oven still carries with it the memory of frugality turned into celebration, and the timeless comfort of a dessert that never asked for much, but gave everything back. Tomato aspic was the gelatin salad that confused generations and defined an entire era of mid-century frugality. It started with tomato juice or canned tomatoes combined with unflavored gelatin, a splash of vinegar, and seasonings like celery salt or onion powder. The mixture was poured into a mold, chilled until set, and sliced like a firm, jiggling loaf. Sometimes vegetables like green peppers, carrots, or olives were suspended inside. Other times it was served plain with a dollop of mayonnaise on top. For those who did not grow up with it, tomato aspic looked like a science experiment. But for those who did, it was a holiday staple, bright, tangy, and oddly refreshing. And while it may have fallen out of fashion, it still lingers in memory, the wobble on the plate, the cold bite of vinegar and spice, and the quiet pride of serving something that looked like more than it cost. Salt pork and Johnny cakes were a 1-2 punch of salt, fat, and starch, Exactly what a hard-working family needed before refrigeration and supermarkets made meat more accessible. Salt pork, heavily cured and stored without the need for cold, was sliced thin and fried in a skillet until crispy and golden. The rendered fat was saved to cook Johnny cakes, simple cornmeal pancakes fried to a crisp edge with a soft, warm middle. Eaten together, they formed a meal that was heavy, satisfying, and deeply rooted in colonial tradition. The salt pork added richness. The Johnny cakes soaked up every drop of flavor. It was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever the day required. Salt pork and Johnny cakes were never about presentation. They were about surviving with dignity and feeding the body when the world demanded every ounce of energy. Leftover mashed potato pancakes were the kitchen's second chance at breakfast. Cold mashed potatoes, dry, dense, and uninviting on their own, were mixed with a bit of flour, maybe an egg, and pan-fried into crisp-edged golden brown cakes. Inside, they stayed soft and creamy. Outside, they crackled. Sometimes they were served with applesauce, sometimes with sour cream, and sometimes just hot off the pan with nothing at all. Grandmothers knew the ratio by heart. Kids called them potato patties or fried clouds. And in homes where food had to stretch, these pancakes were proof that flavor did not require new ingredients, just a little time and a hot pan. The smell of them frying still lingers in memory for many, tied to slow mornings, old cast iron, and that soft sound of something simple becoming something better. Ketchup sandwiches were desperation layered between two slices of bread. No meat, no cheese, just plain white bread and a smear of ketchup, spread thin or thick, depending on how hungry you were. They were tart, sweet, and just barely enough to trick the stomach into feeling full. During the Great Depression, and again during tough stretches in the 1970s and 1980s, ketchup sandwiches appeared in lunchboxes and on dinner plates across America. Some added margarine or butter. Others toasted the bread to feel like they were eating something warm. In many homes, it was not a joke. It was a memory. A moment when a parent opened the fridge, saw only condiments, and made something anyway. Old notebooks rarely listed them, but you would hear about them in stories, passed around at kitchen tables, recalled with a mixture of shame and pride. Kids ate them without knowing what was missing. Adults ate them knowing exactly what was. But they were a meal. They kept the day going. And for many, that tangy bite still brings back a time when you made do with what you had and went to bed grateful you had something at all. Back to the Appalachian region, and this time the Piedmont region as well, a sonker is one of the highlights of Northern Carolina cuisine. It's often served warm with like a generous scoop of ice cream, but it's actually a fruit dessert. These are really popular up in the South, you know? They get very serious about their fruit desserts. It's hard to find out where the dish first originated from, but lots of people believe that farming families that were trying to make the best out of their fruits are the first ones who found it. Actually, a lot of people seem to unanimously agree that it first popped up in Surry County. This is also where it's most well known, so maybe this one has a bit of truth to it. The city of Mount Airy in Surry County is also known for its massive use of sonkers and how it really doesn't ever let up on them. People there make these throughout the year, around the clock, and it's a point of competition for local bakeries too. Surry County even has Sonker Day, which is an annual event that celebrates the dessert. It's this community thing in Pilot Mountain, and people from around the place come and make their best version of a sonker, along with lots of other regional foods that have tons of history. The Sonker contest is one of the best things to check out in the area, so if you're ever around, give it a visit. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Imagine a meal that's thick, hearty, and packed with protein, yet it might not be winning any Michelin stars. That's where this dish comes in. Made from split peas boiled in water, it's simple, filling, and full of energy. Peas porridge, as it was known, was a go-to for soldiers who needed something to fuel them through the day without any frills. The beauty of this dish was that it's inexpensive, easy to prepare, and could be made in large batches. It didn't matter if you were in medieval Europe or marching across the battlefield in the 17th century, peas were a reliable source of nutrition. Soldiers appreciated the protein boost, and for many, it was the backbone of their diet. While it didn't have the most exciting flavor, peas porridge was practical. Soldiers often ate it with a bit of bread, or on a good day, meat or dried herbs to add some variety. The texture was thick, almost like a stew, but still simple enough to cook over a campfire or on a stove. If you were stuck with this dish for days on end, you'd either become an expert in creative seasoning or learn to love the taste of simplicity. If it's good enough to survive a campaign, it's good enough for dinner. If you go on over to central New York, specifically Utica, then you'll actually find an interesting bit of the local cuisine there known as chicken Riggies. Tired of pastas? Give this one a shot. I promise it might turn your world upside down. This dish is entirely inspired by the Italian-American communities that are so dominant throughout Utica, and it's something that you can never go a day without seeing in upstate New York. The strong scent of hot peppers and chili flakes carries for miles, and it's that spice that people most strongly associate with a chicken Riggie. This dish is pretty much named that entirely because it uses a lot of rigatoni pasta, which is the main star of the show here. It's made using chicken, cream, and all kinds of spices, and it even uses banana and cherry peppers. Come on, when's the last time you heard those names in a dish? I'll wait. Until you figure that one out, let's talk about some of the history here. This dish goes back to the 1970s, where it's really popular in Italian-American culture. A lot of people also think it started at the Colonial restaurant in Utica, but that's not confirmed. Either way, this is one of the best regional dishes the states have to offer you. When a meal needed to be stretched as far as possible, soup was often the answer. Cabbage and dough soup was one of the simplest ways to turn a few humble ingredients into something warm, filling, and, on good days, almost satisfying. Cabbage was a Depression-era staple. It was cheap, hearty, and lasted longer than most vegetables. It didn't take much to turn it into soup, just water, salt, and maybe a bit of lard if it was available. But what made this dish unique was the dough. Instead of noodles or potatoes, families made quick, flour-based dumplings. A simple mix of flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, was shaped into lumps and dropped into the boiling broth. The dough swelled as it cooked, making the pot seem fuller and the meal feel more substantial. Many immigrant families, particularly in Eastern Europe, had their own versions of this dish long before the Great Depression. But in America, it became a go-to meal when there was little else. For those who remember eating it, cabbage and dough soup was about getting through another day. It was a reminder that even when ingredients were scarce, a pot of boiling water and a little creativity could still feed a family. Collard greens have been a peasant food for many reasons and for a long time. They were really popular in African American culture for sharecroppers, small farmsteads, rural villages, and more. A lot of people relied on them for centuries, but their reputation was always hat of low-class food. Towards the 20th century, collard greens began to gain some respect as a symbol of the South and its humble, rustic cuisine. Now, what I like to think is that this dish was in the right place at the right time. See, towards the end of the 20th century, there was a massive health scare going around all of America, particularly the South. What can I say? Years of drippings, bacon, lard, fat, and deep frying things in oil or beer or both may do that to you. Collard greens began a light that people were flocking to, full moth style. People were familiar enough with them, had an acquired taste for them too, and liked all the different spins you could throw on the dish. So for a lot of people, they were the first step towards a healthier lifestyle. And that's really why they did a complete 180. During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, this dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that, reliable sustenance no matter the season or the conditions. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Imagine biting into something so hard that it could double as a building material. That was hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. It wasn't exactly a culinary delight, but it was a lifesaver for soldiers and sailors on long campaigns. Its secret was longevity. Properly stored, hardtack could last for years and, in some cases, even decades. But eating it wasn't for the faint of heart or teeth. Soldiers often joked it was hard enough to stop a bullet. To make it edible, many soaked it in water, coffee, or stew to soften it. Without that, breaking it might feel like a test of willpower. Salted and cured to withstand long journeys, dried fish added essential nutrients, though the smell wasn't exactly subtle. Imagine a ship full of men and barrels of dried fish during a humid summer. Let's just say it's a good thing Fabrizi wasn't invented yet. These simple foods fueled explorers, sailors, and armies through grueling months without fresh supplies. Though unassuming, they were engineering marvels of preservation and utility, proof that survival often came at the cost of flavor. The underdog of the Great Depression pantry was turnips, the scrappy little root vegetable that was always at every table. Turnips, with their peppery bite and rock-bottom price, became the saving grace for families who were stretching every penny. Turnips were not just a root to roast, mash, or toss into soups, but a kitchen multitasker. So many families stockpiled turnips during those lean years because they could turn a bare-bones meal into something hearty and comforting with just one turnip. Poor soil was no problem for turnips, which made them a good crop for struggling farmers. In a root cellar, they could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for winter when other fresh vegetables were long gone. But creative cooks came up with ways to bake them into casseroles, pair them with potatoes to stretch a mash further, or pickle them for a tangy treat. Sweetened turnip puddings, for instance, surprised many with their richness. Even desserts weren't off limits. Turnips aren't a staple of the grocery cart these days, but they've worked their way into farm-to-table menus and rustic recipes. They weren't a trendy choice back then, but they survived in vegetable form. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. A lot of the reason that something ends up being considered rich is because people with money tend to really just value the different subtleties and nuances in their ingredients. Heirloom tomatoes were once considered a poor man's food, tasting different than how the usual ones did. This is what led to a lot of people just marking them off and thinking they're not really worth the time or money, but later on, this is exactly what made them rise to fame too. Plus, there was a practical reason. Heirloom tomatoes were grown with an emphasis on flavor, complexity, and just being a generally more pleasant experience with more depth when it came to flavor. Normal tomatoes were grown prioritizing their resistance to rot and disease. They were meant to last long and be sturdy. Farmers didn't really think much of how juicy they would be, how they would feel to touch, and the texture. Later on, towards the end of the 20th century, it was these exact reasons that caused heirloom tomatoes to start becoming more and more beloved among food circles in America. Now, they're considered a very premium ingredient. Offal had almost a one-to-one copy of bone marrow's experience. It was offal that was considered peasant food since way before any of our recent centuries, like this thing goes as far back as sardines do. Organ meats have never really been popular in any part of America, historically speaking, not until recently. But how did we get here? Well, a lot of chefs had a hand in helping people be more open to the benefits of nose-to-tail eating. If you aren't familiar with the term, it just means to not waste any part of the animal, from the nose right down to the tail. They wouldn't just serve it up in a gamey, metallic-tasting stew, though. They'd give proper recipes with sides and dips accompanying the offal dish, bringing out the best in. Plus, besides just high-end restaurants and an appreciation for different kinds of food growing among the American people, it kind of got popular with the foodies. Lots of high-end restaurants started using liver mousses, braised hearts, or roasted bone marrow in their dishes. It's a whole thing. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. Gooey buttercake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for two reasons. Gooey buttercake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis Gooey Buttercake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. For centuries, armies on the move relied on foods that were as tough as the soldiers themselves. Dried beans and lentils were real tiny powerhouses of nutrition that were easy to carry, nearly impossible to spoil, and packed with protein and calories. With a little water and patience, these humble legumes could transform into a hearty meal capable of sustaining entire armies. They were very economical. A single sack of lentils could feed dozens, making them a staple in ancient armies like the Romans and the Greeks. Lentils were so integral to the Roman diet that some historians called them the soldier's caviar, though that might have been more wishful thinking than reality. Cooking them, however, wasn't always straightforward. Soldiers often had to soak them overnight, a luxury they didn't always have during marches or battles. This meant the occasional crunchy surprise when time ran out. Despite their simplicity, beans and lentils had one undeniable perk. They could adapt to almost any flavor. Whether cooked in a broth with onions and herbs or simply boiled with a pinch of salt, they delivered the nourishment soldiers needed to keep fighting. And while no one was writing poetry about legumes, one thing was certain: these little guys pulled their weight. For centuries, armies on the move relied on foods that were as tough as the soldiers themselves. Dried beans and lentils were real tiny powerhouses of nutrition that were easy to carry, nearly impossible to spoil, and packed with protein and calories. With a little water and patience, these humble legumes could transform into a hearty meal capable of sustaining entire armies. They were very economical. A single sack of lentils could feed dozens, making them a staple in ancient armies like the Romans and the Greeks. Lentils were so integral to the Roman diet that some historians called them the soldier's caviar, though that might have been more wishful thinking than reality. Cooking them, however, wasn't always straightforward. Soldiers often had to soak them overnight, a luxury they didn't always have during marches or battles. This meant the occasional crunchy surprise when time ran out. Despite their simplicity, beans and lentils had one undeniable perk. They could adapt to almost any flavor. Whether cooked in a broth with onions and herbs or simply boiled with a pinch of salt, they delivered the nourishment soldiers needed to keep fighting. And while no one was writing poetry about legumes, one thing was certain: these little guys pulled their weight. For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them: peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat in every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? If one of these meals stirred a memory from your childhood table, share it in the comments, then like, subscribe, and help us pass these forgotten recipes down before they disappear for good.